Today, we continue our discussion about marriage because apparently, like the definitions of man, woman, and child, no one has any idea what marriage actually is. Apparently, this is the question we must now answer, as if thousands of years of human history didn't already make this clear. We're now forced to cover old ground and get back to basics, which really is what we often do here at Church Public. To get to marriage, though, we need to take a short journey from the current political situation, politicians, the cultural zeitgeist, if you will, or otherwise known as the spirit of the age. We've got to go from what is proposed right now to what is actually real. Through this process, we'll look at immigration, we'll look at same sex marriage, divorce, and the current trans ideology. And if those don't sound like they're connected, they really actually are, and quite a bit so. So we're going to get to all that. So get ready. I'm Matt Odegaard, and this is Church Public. Welcome back to Church Public. My name is Matt Odegaard, and I really appreciate you stopping by today. We have a lot to talk about. I know on the last podcast we talked a bit about marriage, but it's so important that we have to keep talking about it because it just seems to be misunderstood in a lot of ways. And so we need to get into that. But to get into that, we got to get into a bunch of other topics and some current events from a Christian perspective. That's what we do here at Church Public. So hang on for the ride, and we're going to get through all of this. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the like button and the subscribe button and the, send fresh cookies button. No, I wish there was a button for that. There's not really a button for that, but there's a lot of buttons. Hit all the buttons and just mash them all right now. That'd be really great. And if this is helpful to you in any way, go ahead and hit the share button. It's an arrow or a swoosh or who knows what it is at this point, but hit that one too. Send it to somebody because I just want to help you. I want to help you understand what it is to be a Christian, to live as a Christian. And really, that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today too, because what this culture, this political climate, the politicians, the state, what they're all attempting to do, from my perspective, is put you as a Christian into a box. They want you to live in the box of you can be religious, you can have faith, but only in your house and maybe in this location called the church, or if you're Jewish, synagogue, et cetera, et cetera. But really, today I'm just going to focus on Christianity because that's the place where I live in. And that's really what the state is telling you. It's saying you have to live in the place of your faith, living at home when no one else is around, or in the church where it's okay to do that. But everywhere else, not acceptable. And the reason it's not acceptable is you are just too slow and old fashioned, probably dumb, to really have understood the enlightenment of all of the wonderful things that this world is bringing to bear through its progressive thoughts, actions, worldview. You just don't understand it because you're not intellectual enough and enlightened enough. You don't have enough brain power to get there. That's how they're viewing you. I'm just telling you. Like, you don't have to believe me, but just listen to some of the stories that we're seeing today. This is how they think of you. They think that you're just old and dumb and can't really figure out this because you just have this book. I've got it right here. I'll grab it here. You have this book that is, I'm just holding up a Bible if you're listening. And by the way, there's a video version of this you can check out online, probably on the YouTubes if YouTube will let me be there today. If not, I'll message somewhere and put a link to somewhere where the video is because it's out there. So again, if you're just listening, I was holding up the Bible. I'll hold it up again for you. And the thing is, they just think you are dumb because you're stuck in the Bible. You're stuck in the Bible. You can't get beyond the Bible. You can't get enlightened into a new, sophisticated reality, this new world that we're in. You just can't get there because you're stuck. I mean, that's the best way I can put it. It just they accuse you of being stuck. If you really understood, if you really were enlightened, you would move on to this higher plane of knowledge, this higher plane of wisdom, and you would really understand and know that there's more to this world and there's more to understand. But you can't. You can't get there because you're stuck to the Bible and you're silly for believing in the Bible. Everybody else has given up on the Bible because they know. I mean, there's some good ideas in there, right? This is how the world views it. There's some good ideas in the Bible. It's nice. It has some wise sayings. Maybe Jesus was a good guy. He just said love, and love is love. So that's what he said, obviously. So that's what we should all do. Only that's not what's in the Bible. And those that read the Bible, no, that's not really what's in the Bible. So today we're talking about Christianity broadly, how to be Christian in the cultural context, right? Current events from a Christian perspective. And we're talking about marriage because that really is the nucleus. It's the center point of the natural world. in order to build this society, you have to have marriage because you have to have family. Because to have a family, you have to get married and have a baby. I mean, this, I don't know why I have to talk about this, but apparently I have to talk about this because we don't understand this anymore. And we don't understand where babies come from anymore. And we don't understand what women are. And we don't know what men are. And we don't know what marriage is. We don't know any of these things that have been the staple, the center point of all of society for thousands of years. We don't understand it anymore because, as I mentioned, the left, the liberals have exploded the ideas, exploded the definitions, expected you to follow along with this, and said, well, we don't need those institutions anymore because they're old and they're fuddy-duddy and they go along with this book. So we don't need those institutions. We don't need this book. We don't need that religion. We don't need this faith because we can create through technology, science, or just the sheer force of our will. We can create whatever we want to create. That's what we're being told, which is why all of these topics move in together. So the first topic that we're going to look at today is immigration, which you say, well, immigration, that doesn't have anything to do with marriage. Yeah, kind of, except that it does. The reason it does is marriage produces babies. By definition, that's what marriage does. The reason you get married is to start a family and to have babies. I know you're going to say, well, not everybody who gets married can have babies. I know, but we have to talk in general terms. And the general terms of getting married is to have babies. That's just why. For all of history, you got married so that you could start a family, so that you could grow your family unit and pass on your values, and especially, as we talk about a lot, your faith, and then grow that into communities, grow that into the church, institutions that supported marriage throughout all of history. We need to talk about those things. And you ask, well, what does that have to do with immigration? Here's the problem. Because the left has this habit of, what do I say, atomizing everything down to its tiny little part, but then changing the definition of that part and then saying, well, let's put it all back together, but it doesn't go back together because you've blown up a definition and now it doesn't mean anything. So here's where we're going with this. The amount of children in America, the amount of children America is having, families are having in America, has been going down dramatically. I've talked about this many, many times before. It's actually a worldwide problem. But it's bad in America. And it's so bad that even Democrats, even the left, is noticing because the population, especially of young people, especially of families and marriages producing children, is going down, down, down. So to me, the obvious conclusion of that would be, well, let's encourage the family. Let's encourage people to get married. Let's encourage people to have children. I'll say that a lot. The left's conclusion is something different. Let's just hear what the left's conclusion is, and then we'll go on from there. Here we go. Check this out.
Now more than ever, we're short of workers. We have a population that is not reproducing it on its own with the same level that it used to. The only way we're going to have a great future in America is if we welcome and embrace immigrants, the dreamers, and all of them, because our ultimate goal is to help the dreamers, but get a path to citizenship for all 11 million or however many undocumented there are here.
So listen to what he said. So that was Chuck Schumer, the senator, and I have to explain this. This is a little bit of an obtuse idea if you've never heard of this, but we have to talk about this for a moment. And this is called the Great Replacement Theory, which is a terribly racist idea that you're replacing one race with another. That's at the baseline of it. I'm not going to get into the political ideology of the rest of it, but the reality is, in America, for instance, the growth of our society should be less about race. I've said this on so many different levels, both in this theory, but also in critical race theory and a bunch of other theories. The growth of our nation, and historically the growth of America, has been less about race and more about ideals. I mean, specifically, you can even point to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if you want to just stick with those. But there's a lot of different ideals because America as an ideal is a place that you can grow and do the best that you can based on how much energy and work you put into it. And this is really good, right? This is something that we really want to point into. But now we have this new ideal where the growth of America is not based on that. And we're creating all of these different pockets of tribes. We're tribalizing America, which is really bad. So this great replacement theory has been a talking point for decades, and it actually has been a Democratic talking point for decades. But if you mentioned it, you were the terrible racist if you noticed that the Democrats were trying to replace the population instead of with babies, instead of with people who normalized into American society, ideology, you know, saying the Pledge of Allegiance, going through the actual immigration process rather than just walking across the border and living according to whatever they wanted to live. This idea that they would come and replace some of the voters was viewed as a horribly racist idea. But you have Chuck Schumer literally saying it right here. There's 11 million, or however many there are, those are his words, of immigrants that have come over. And we have to figure that out. So, as I mentioned, he points out that we are low on babies. We're low on babies because families are not getting married, they're not having babies. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But the conclusion, according to this senator and many on the left, is we just need to make all of the immigrants that are already here, the millions of them, and just make them citizens. Period. Just like stamp them citizens rather than going through a process. I happen to be married to a person who went through the immigration process legally, and it was not difficult, but it was a process. And my wife is very proud to be an American and has picked up on all these ideals of America. And that's how we do it. That's how you should do it, because you should live where you want to live and where you believe in living. If you bring all of your things into the place that you live, but don't change to the place that you live, it destroys that place. And we'll look more about that in a second. So here is the idea of this replacement theory. It's that the Democratic voters would come in, or sorry, immigrants would come in and vote Democrat because they would be aligned with that. And this is the reality that he's actually saying right here. And again, for years, if Republicans said this or conservatives said that this was actually happening, they would be labeled crazy and racist and all these other things. However, now you have Chuck Schumer literally saying that very thing, and he's applauded for it. Another case, this is just, it's almost, if it wasn't so tragic, it'd be humorous. Like, it's another one of these cases where this isn't actually happening ever anywhere. But when it does happen, it's really, really good, and we need to celebrate it. It's just another one of those things. Clearly, that's what's happening. So we get to birth rates. I mean, I've talked about this so much, and I'm not going to get into all the numbers today because I've talked about it before, and you can look it up. And the American birth rate has dropped below replacement level. What does that mean? That means the economy, just economically, it's not going to sustain the amount of people that we have. This is what he's talking about. He's like, hey, our infrastructure can't be supported because there's not enough people being born in America. He's right. And that's actually a really big problem. We're going to have to figure out what to do with this. His solution is just rubber stamp everybody who came in and bring in whomever you want, and just bring in all these immigrants, illegal or not, doesn't matter. Just stamp them in, and then they're part of the infrastructure of America. But ideologically, this is a really big problem. And the baby problem is not even just an economic problem, I would say, because this is, again, the lane that I drive in all the time in terms of spirituality, morality. This is actually a really big moral problem. And this is the bigger problem, right? When you raise children, you teach them their values, you teach them faith. This is crucial for maintaining a society because it literally propagates community in an actual and, more importantly, a moral sense. You tell the community how we're supposed to live, right from wrong. It's really important. What's being argued here is that since we don't have enough babies, the solution is not to promote families marrying and having more babies, but instead bring tens of millions, literally, his words, of illegal aliens into the country to replace those that are not born. This has many, many problems, but not the least of which of these problems is that there's no values or faith passed on to these illegal immigrants. They come from countries far and wide with vastly different ideals and morals and faith. In the past, when immigrants came into America, they were encouraged by many means to adopt the values herein. I've already talked about that a little bit. These new aliens are not encouraged to do that in any such way. And in fact, the left, if they were honest, and sometimes they are, they don't want people to adopt America's values because the left doesn't like America's values. They don't want to conserve anything. They don't want this old fuddy-duddy Bible. We talked about that. We'll talk about that more in a minute. They don't want any of the values that America has now. They want other values. So to bring other people in that have these other values, that's a win-win for them, right? So they want to maintain whatever values they are. And they wouldn't even say that you should adopt the values of America or impose your American values on anybody, because, of course, that would be colonizing. And in their eyes, that's evil as well. The reality is, and they don't like America. And so they're bringing in people that probably also don't like America, or at the very least, don't care if they like America or not. I just looked it up. There are approximately 240,000 people per month coming across the southern border, not including the gotaways, which are hard to count because they got away. 240,000 per month right now coming across the southern border. And this is the bottom line. The left doesn't want you to have more kids. I mean, that's really what we get into here. They just don't. They don't want you to have more kids. They don't want you to grow a family because they don't like America and they don't want to propagate America. And this leads us to kind of a big problem. Like, it leads us to a place where we don't have a future. I mean, and this isn't like being hyperbolic or even doomsday. It's just the reality. We don't have a future because everything that creates a future of civilization has been carved away from our culture. And this is really a problem, not to mention the next generation. One of the institutions, this is where we start getting into marriage. One of the institutions that is needed for healthy civilization is marriage. It is an institution that just literally and figuratively propagates culture and civilization. We have babies, the babies grow, the babies have babies. This is how you grow out in civilization while bringing your values and especially what I would argue for, your faith into this place. Without that, you're winging it. And even more so, probably bringing in other ideals. I've just been studying some of the minor prophets in the Bible, and over and over and over again, the issue that the minor prophets are dealing with is the issue of the people of God mingling with the people outside of the kingdom and bringing in false gods and idols and weird rituals that are bad and immoral and destructive. I mean, lots of weird sexual immorality and baby killing. And if that sounds like what we're dealing with today, it's kind of because it's the same and there's nothing new under the sun. But again, this is where we are. We're repeating the cycle. And that is just historically where civilizations die when they stop knowing who they are, what they are, or why they are, right? Why are you a civilization? Why do you get together as a country? Why do you get together as a nation? Why do you care to be together? And in a large part, in my estimation, an observation of America, they don't want to be together. Uh, we're just not in the place where we want that anymore. So we get back to marriage. The left doesn't support it or encourage marriage in any way. When you take away the incentives for marriage, you see the results as we're living in them. So this is the bigger problem. And we're going to get to the same-sex marriage issue, but really, there's a bigger issue at hand. And the bigger issue is just marriage in general. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. You can go and listen to the last podcast where we talked about the Respect for Marriage Act in detail. You can go and listen to that. It's an act that's coming through. It already came through the House. It's going through the Senate. It's still being voted on in the Senate. There's one more step there. Then it'll go back to the House. But all the politicians at this point have said they're going to pass it. And it looks like it probably will. So anyway, we talked about that. But what we have to do is take a step back because ultimately this is just the end result. This is the end piece of all of the issues that we have destroyed marriage over the last, I don't know, 5 decades or so. People right now are getting married later and later into their 20s, 30s, and even 40s. And when they do, they don't have 4 kids or 5 kids or 8 kids. They have 1 kid or maybe 2 kids, definitely not 3 or 4. So, I mean, even, let's see, do I have this here? This is a slide from the United Kingdom here where this was a study the United Kingdom just did that they're predicting in a couple of years, the marriage rate is going to be 1 in 400. 1 in 400 couples. That is tremendously low. This is a study, again, in the United Kingdom where it's only going to be 1 in 400. So that's the question. Do you think that's going to have an impact on society? Do you think that society is going to be able to support itself when no one is getting married and no one is having babies? And this is exactly what Schumer is talking about. And he's right on that sense. We're not getting married and we're not having babies, and that's a problem. And you can't prop up society with less people. It just doesn't work that way. So this is the natural reaction, right? When the population stops getting married, of course, they have less children. That's just actually what happens. Everybody knows that. That's the natural reaction. So this now, finally, leads us to same-sex marriage. And you'll say, well, that's a dead issue, right? It was decided in Oberfeld in 2015. And now, as I mentioned, in the House and the Senate, they're passing this Respect for Marriage Act. I talked about it a little bit yesterday. We'll be talking about it in the future because it's still in the works, but it looks like it's going to go through. So you look at Obergefell, and it is legally decided in that sense. But any society who gives up on the institution of marriage just doesn't have a future, and that's what we're talking about. So this Respect for Marriage Act, it clearly is just another euphemism that they're giving you. Like women's health is the euphemism for killing babies, et cetera, et cetera. You could call it the same-sex marriage bill. That would be fine. But the Respect for Marriage Act, it's just not that. So it does a couple things. We got to talk about what it actually does for a moment, so that we can understand where we're going with all this. The Respect for Marriage Act, it creates this legislation for same-sex couples, but it's connected to interracial marriage. And they're saying both things, and that's the trick. I think it's again, I think it's a trick in this. Excuse me. I think it's a trick in this bill, in this act, to trick people into voting for it, in the sense of there's just no one who is voting against interracial marriage. There literally is, like, I couldn't find a news story. I mean, sure, there's some fringy, weird people who just don't like humans. Great. Like anyway, that's terrible. But there is no, like, current politician that's saying we have to stop interracial marriage. It doesn't exist. But you end up being labeled a racist if you won't vote for this Respect for Marriage Act, because if you say, hey, I don't want to codify same-sex marriage, they say, well, that means you don't want interracial marriage. And you're like, no, we weren't talking about that at all, because no one is talking about that, because that ship has sailed. Anybody should marry anybody, man and woman. Men and women can marry across racial lines, and it's all fine. Sure, there can be differences between races, but and those can be large, and there's customs, and I get all of that. But the difference between an interracial marriage between a man and a woman is as far as the East is from the West, between the marriage between a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. It's not even close. It's not even the same ballpark. But this bill is trying to make it seem like they're the same, and they're not, which is the same thing. Excuse me. The same thing that we keep talking about, because the left is saying there's no difference between man and woman, period. A man can be a woman and a woman can be a man. This is what we're talking about, which also is kind of a fascinating piece, because in the same sentence, they'll say a man can actually be a woman. If you said you were a different race, you would be run out of town, because you can't say that. Anyway, that's where everything is backwards, and we're in backwards town. No one is arguing for interracial marriage to be ended. No one is arguing for that. This bill is not about that. It's a Trojan horse inside this bill, where they can say, if you don't vote for this, you hate, you're racist, and all of this. But it's not about that. This bill is clearly about same-sex marriage. And the bill passed the Senate 62 to 37, and 12 Republicans voted for the bill. And remember, this bill, with a couple of different changes into it, and it's going to go back to the House and have more changes still. But in July, it passed with 47 Republicans for it. I mean, that's where, 59 Republicans over the course of these two houses have voted for this bill. And that is not conservative. That's why we have to keep talking about this, because if you're going to conserve, you have to know what you're going to conserve. And clearly, people just don't know what they're conserving. So this is what we have to talk about. So let's take a moment to talk about what the law says, because it has implications on Christian worldview and practice. So this law says, if Obergefell for some reason is overturned, which is not going to be, I mean, I'll throw my opinion out there. It'd be great if it is, but it's not going to be. But if, for instance, that happens, then same-sex couples can still get married and have their marriage recognized. And another thing that this bill says is that states have reciprocity to other states as far as marriage. So, for instance, if you are in a same-sex marriage and you get married in California and you go to Texas where there's no same-sex marriage, or it's different in Texas or any of the other states where it is different, Texas would have to offer the same legal precedent as California. The issue with the first bill from the House was it did not have adequate protection for churches and other religious institutions. So if a same-sex couple came to your church and said, we want you to marry us, you had to say yes, according to the first bill. Apparently that has been changed. So now the bill does include protection for churches and synagogues, so they don't have to marry same-sex couples if they don't want to, though there are some legal experts who said the exemptions that they put in are rather flimsy. That's again something that will remain to be seen. But what the bill does not have is protection for any other business. And that's where this cultural Christian worldview question comes into play. This is really where we need to spend a little bit of time. So even if you threw out the churches, the synagogues, and said, okay, um, you know, maybe churches are safe, maybe religious institutions are safe with this bill and it doesn't change anything for them. You can't force them to do anything. Okay, maybe that's true. What about the other businesses? And this is where again, the rubber meets the road, and the culture is telling you what they think of you as a believer, as a person of faith, as a Christian. Essentially, this bill is saying to you, sure, you can have your faith, you can have your values, you can hold up this book and say, I believe it, whatever, I read it, I like it. You can believe that marriage, by definition, is between a man and a woman, Genesis 1. But you can only do that in your house and maybe in this little box called the church. That's it. Those are the only places you get to have your values. It's the only places you get to hold up your Bible and say, yeah, I believe in this, but I believe in it all the way. And that's where, as Christians, we run into a problem, because if you ask any Christian, even if you expand that, ask any Jew, any Muslim, do you only have faith in your house or in your church or synagogue or mosque? And the answer, of course, would be no, they have their faith everywhere. A good Christian, if it is a good Christian, which hopefully if you're listening to this, you are, um, you would say, I follow Jesus everywhere. My whole life is revolved around who Jesus is and what Jesus means to me. But this bill, which is an extension of culture, so the culture is saying to you, no, you're not allowed to do that. You can have your faith, you can have it at home where nobody sees you, you can have it at church where everybody's like you, but you cannot have it in your business. You cannot have it in your school. You cannot have it anywhere else, only in this little box. But on the other hand, you must believe that marriage is whatever they say it is everywhere else. For instance, the cake baker in Colorado has been, though he did win this case, was forced to bake a cake for your gay wedding. Again, he won that case. Long story. The graphic designer will be forced to design graphics for your coming out party. The photographer will be forced to photograph your gay wedding or go out of business. And again, if you think I'm exaggerating, look up all these cases. They've already happened and more. This opens the door far and wide for more of these things. That business, whatever your business is not protected. If you're a Christian and you have a business, you have to serve the culture in the way that the culture wants, not in the way your faith wants. And so you run into this problem between, are you a Christian or are you a businessman? Or are you a Christian businessman? Or can you be? Are you just a businessman and you have to not be a Christian? You have to lay your faith aside and do whatever the culture wants you to do. That's what this bill is actually asking. And that is what the culture is asking. So again, I've said this over and over and over and over again, that politics is downstream from culture. And this is a great example that culture is saying that you must follow it. You can't do what you want to do. And so what this does is it establishes this cultural standard, and it is a moral cultural standard. The standard is, morally, the only reason you think same-sex couples are not allowed to marry is that you're old-fashioned, you're a bigot, you're evil, you're a silly religious person. I started talking about this earlier, but this is the reality. Again, if you're not watching, I'm holding up my Bible. I'm doing that a lot today. But this is the reality that culture is telling you. If you read this, if you believe this, if you act out on the tenets of your faith based on what God has told you through scripture, you're a silly religious person who reads this silly old book and actually believes it, and you're judgmental and old and silly, etc., etc. I think you get the point. And the only reason the culture would say they allow you to hold those views is that if you really show you have faith in them. How do you do that? Well, I guess it's if you hold up your Bible and say, I really believe this, and I go to the box, the building with the cross on top, right? That's the only reason that you're actually allowed to have this. But you can't have those ideas outside. You can only have those ideas inside the building with cross on top. You cannot, this is the culture is saying, you cannot bring those ideas outside into the real world, because the rest of the world is enlightened and progressive and wonderful, and the real people that are in real life actually live outside of there. You, with your silly ideas from the silly old book, you don't get to go outside and say these ideas, because that's not real, right? That's what they're saying to you. So they're saying that same-sex marriage is actually a moral good. It's wonderful and it makes society better. And you should agree because you should be enlightened. And if you do agree, then you are enlightened and then you're good. And when you don't agree, you're just old and silly and stupid and you think your ideas of marriage are right, but you're just old and it's this silly little book. And if it wasn't for this silly little book, you would be enlightened too. And this is already true in other areas. I mean, we've talked so much about the media, but Hollywood, right? Movies. Hollywood now has a gay character in every movie. It's just the way every movie has to be. And in every commercial, it just has to be this way. And now we know, even in kids' animated programs like the Not So Secret Gay Agenda that Disney revealed earlier this year, that's just what Hollywood is full of. And of course, this has already been enshrined in our public education system. I've been talking about this ad nauseum. Literally, I'm nauseous about it. But they say, the public education system says, you must teach children, beginning at the youngest of ages, about LGBTQAAIP hashtag ideology and same-sex marriage, because they need to know about it so that they can medically transition through puberty. This bill treats biblical morality as bigotry and hatred. And this is the problem. And this is the world that we are just now living in. So this is the idea of the culture. They treat biblical morality. And even if you don't believe the Bible and you're just listening going, well, I don't even believe that book. What about natural law? I mean, what about the fact that for all of time, a man and a woman make a baby? I mean, that's just biology. It's natural law. But even that is just bigotry and hatred now. And this is really not even about same-sex marriage. It's about marriage, period, because it's the tip of the iceberg. Same-sex marriage is the tip of the iceberg. It's just the final conclusion of this whole thing. When you see an iceberg on the water, it's only the smallest part that's above the water, and the rest of the iceberg is massive. And in this case, I think that certainly holds true. Marriage as a whole has been destroyed for decades, and now you're seeing it come into same-sex issues. But the reality is, it's been destroyed for so long. Family and marriage used to be about the building block of society. I've talked about this a lot, even today. For all of human history, this was the case. You married, you raised a family. That was the smallest unit, went into the community, and it grew outward and outward and outward. And then social structures around it, like the church, etc., held up marriage. But this is not what we have now, and we haven't had it for 50 or 60 years. Marriage used to be about family formation, about the family unit, about the community, but not about the individual. But now everything is about the individual. And that's really the bottom line of where we are as a society. Everything is about the individual. Everything is about you. A great book about this, if you're into reading, is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman. I'm not going to summarize it right here, but it is a really good read on the individual and how we've gotten there. But historically, a mom and a dad had children. You were born into a family. You had a mom and dad, and they were connected to their mom and dad. And then you had children, and the children were connected to brothers and cousins and other family members and friends, and it just went out from there. And again, like I said, they shared value. You did not invent the world, and the world doesn't revolve around you. I spent a lot of time in my family talking about that. I spent a lot of time being a pastor talking about that. The world just doesn't revolve around you. Your belonging was to this family. You belonged to it, and you had responsibilities. And the community was an extension of that. And this whole flow was the key to society working because the values and your faith went out from there. The basic element of this is marriage. But the basic element of marriage was not love, as we see in all the movies now, but duty. I know that doesn't sound very romantic, and it doesn't sound like all the romantic comedies that we grew up with and you love, and I understand that. But those are actually terrible examples of real relationships, and they're actually not even real. Obviously, it's just fiction. But this duty throughout all of history was to your spouse and to your children and to your parents, and that duty built and grew strong foundations for society. I mean, after all, the fifth commandment in the 10 Commandments is honor your father and mother so that it will go well with you. And that was an important part of reality. That's why you got married. That's why you got married in the church, because after your family, the church was the next building block. You dedicated yourself not only to your spouse, but to your community. You said, till death do you do us part. And you meant it because that's the fabric of the society you built upon. And if you tore that fabric, the whole community suffered. But we have destroyed that entirely by individualizing everything to the smallest form and to the smallest atom. Now, if you get married at all, you're supposed to try it out first. You're supposed to have sex first, and then maybe you move in together. And then maybe if you're one of those old silly goose people with old silly values, maybe you got married. But marriage is not now about the family unit. The only value is about your own personal pleasure. That's why same sex marriage is just the final end in this whole marriage downfall. We lost the thread of marriage long ago, and we decided that personal happiness was the ultimate goal. So divorce got easier if you even got married in the first place, because why would you get married? That just eliminates the freedom and fun of being in a relationship, right? I mean, that's what the culture is telling us even today. America long ago gave up on families and marriage. Societies needed to hold up marriage socially by encouraging couples to stay together, and now the opposite is entirely true. Think about it. Does culture currently support monogamy? No, of course it doesn't. After the 50s, America decided we don't need marriage and we don't need monogamy and we don't need the family more broadly. Birth control was obviously a big part of this. Biology, I mean, biology should help determine family. I mean, we see that because, surprise, sex leads to babies. But birth control severed that connection. You just didn't need it anymore. And there was welfare, which removed the family connection. Then government became your husband, so you don't need an actual husband. And even if you did get pregnant, you didn't need a family, so the marriage went out the window. This and other things in culture made marriage seem like a holdover from this ancient society that technology and progressive biology made useless. We just don't need marriage at all anymore. The only problem is all of that is a lie. All of it is a lie. And even good old Chuck Schumer admits we need more babies. We don't have enough babies. And to have babies, you need a mom and a dad. You just do. This no-fault divorce, rising levels of late marriage, living together have just blown up the definition of marriage already. And that's the problem that we have right now. And this is why so many conservatives and Republicans voted for same-sex marriage, because we have blown up the idea and the definition of marriage, and the only value that we have now is love. Marriage equals love. So you're not in love, don't get married. Or if you're not in love anymore, get a divorce. If you are in love with the same-sex person, get married. Because why wouldn't you? Because the only value is love. Or if you're in love with three people, why don't the three of you get married? After all, love is love. I mean, what's the limiting principle? There is no limiting principle. If you want to marry a child, why wouldn't you marry a child? Because love is love. I know that's disgusting and terrible, but this is the ultimate end of this culture that we have created. There just isn't any other explanation for it. This is an example of politics downstream from culture. Culture has just lost the thread of marriage and family long ago, and that leads to this weird place where we just can't define a woman. The culture says, I don't know, because historically, a woman married a man and had a baby. That's the definition of all of it. Woman, man, baby, family, marriage. It's all right there, but as a society, they cannot admit that. The thread is just gone. The definition is just gone. And marriage, the question, what is marriage, is at the very root of this whole foundation. So when you replace the duty of marriage with something just like amorphous, like the idea of love, it's no wonder we're in the state that we're in. So this leads to declining birth rates, skyrocketing rates of single motherhood. I think I looked, it was like 40% of all babies are born out of wedlock. And people are not even having babies at large. In the 50s, the rate was like 3. And we're well below 2. In some places, we're even below 1 in America. So maybe people have 1 kid, maybe 2. Those crazy people like me who have 4 or more are just religious crazy bigots that you probably watch documentaries about. So Schumer says, we don't need babies. What we need in order to prop this whole thing up is just bring in tens and tens of millions of people into America. And finally, we get back into same-sex marriage because it's all about who you love. And society's job is just to say, yes, thumbs up. You're amazing. You should love who you love, because what does it matter? I mean, Justice Kennedy basically said this. The government it should give you respect and should give you honor. But the government isn't supposed to respect and honor you. The government is supposed to protect you and give you some basic services under the Constitution. That's all they're supposed to do. But this is just the reality of the culture that we live in. And now we're seeing politics and law reinforce the culture that we live in. And this leads to no babies, no families, no marriage, mass immigration to fill the gap, and you make abortion the greatest good. And this is what we've seen over and over again, because family formation is bad, according to culture. Accidental family formation is really, really, really bad. So it must be protected by the sacrament of abortion because there's now a moral good because it protects the love you have. So you don't have to share it with another person, even a baby, unless you choose to, because it's, again, all about you. It's about your choice. My body, my choice. AOC reminds us that abortion is good because then you don't force people to give birth. Let's look at this clip for a moment from AOC.
It is an economic issue. Forcing poor and working class people to give birth against their will, against their consent, against their ability to provide for themselves or a child is a profound economic issue. And it's certainly a way to keep a workforce basically conscripted to large-scale employers and to employers to work more against their will, to take second and third jobs against their desire and their own autonomy.
Right. So she says that, forcing people to have babies is an economic bad because babies are bad and having babies are bad. And society used to say that, babies are a blessing and having babies is the most important thing. And they set up institutions to support babies because babies are really important. Like, and institutions like the church would support the family, and other institutions around would support the family and the babies and the family and grandparents and cousins, and everything would go through. But you have the feminist revolution that says a woman needs a bike like a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. Again, we don't need men, you don't need women, you don't need babies. Kids are just irrelevant. You live your life and you be you, and you get divorced if you want, and if you don't want a family anymore, your happiness is the most important thing. That's what this culture keeps saying. And of course, this now leads to the trans revolution, and this is where we get it all. This is this is the reality of it. And I've heard so many people I've talked to and said, "How did this LGBT stuff come up so fast? How did the trans stuff come up so fast? Like, how did it just possibly come up so fast? Because it wasn't there at all, and then all of a sudden, it's everywhere." And the reality is, it was right under the surface the whole time with this marriage issue. Because once you eliminate the definition of woman, you eliminate the definition of man, you don't want babies, you don't want families, you don't want marriage, then you just realize that men are women and women are men and everybody's everybody, and we're just all interchangeable pieces, and you just put them wherever you want because there's no definition of anything. It doesn't matter anyway. And this is where we get to the trans revolution, because women can be men and men can be women according to this ideology. And family doesn't matter, and women don't matter, and babies don't matter, et cetera, et cetera. Your gender is just about who you love, and you love who you love. So who you love doesn't matter because it is just what it is. And this is AOC again, and talking about how trans people are a big part of this whole thing.
I think another thing that I'd like to address is that the same folks who tell us and told us that COVID's just a flu, that climate change isn't real, that January 6th was nothing but a tourist visit, are now trying to tell us that transgender people are not real. And I would say that their claim is probably just as legitimate as all their others, which is to say, not very much.
And that's where this leads us. She says that, COVID's just a flu, climate change isn't real, January 6th is a tourist visit. But the reality here is that what she's saying is that marriage is not important, and abortion is an act of moral good, and men can actually be women, literally. And all of these are really connected together. And this is the really big part of it. Marriage is the reality that there is a man, there is a woman, and the man and woman together create a child. That's what marriage actually does. And that's the reality of where this all should go and does go in the natural world, in the biological world, and of course in the spiritual world. Man is real, woman is real, children are a product of that through the institution of marriage, which predates government, which government does not create marriage. Government can approve marriage, but government doesn't create marriage. And that's this weird world that we're in, where we believe our rights come from government as a culture, but our rights don't come from government. Our rights come from God, and government protects those rights if it's a good government. If it is slipping into a not so good government, or as history has shown, a very not good government, then the government takes away those rights. But they don't come from the government. Rights come from God, because marriage comes from God, and men and women come from God. Everything comes from God, but we just don't understand that anymore. We don't understand the reality of life anymore. So trans is just the ultimate extension of this. The idea that there's neither male nor female nor child. And that's just the logical outcome of replacing the family. And this is where we go in policy. And I know I'm going a little bit long today, but I feel like this is important, and it really is all connected. And I want you to understand how it's all connected so that you can understand what happens, because I want you to be able to see this and respond to this in an appropriate way. So San Francisco, I know San Francisco, the center of the universe, not really, but but there are many people and politicians who want San Francisco to be the model of the world. So we have to talk about it. So San Francisco is doing a guaranteed income for trans individuals, $1,200 per month. So, and according to Libs of TikTok, who got their hands on the application, apparently there are 96, almost 100 genders that you can choose on this form to apply for the $1,200 a month. San Francisco Mayor London Breed announced the city would begin accepting applications for the GIFT, Guaranteed Income for Trans People, program Wednesday. The program is exclusive to transgender residents of the city, led by the Transgender District, a neighborhood for the city for transgender people. According to the mayor's office, the payments will be regular and unconditional for qualified applicants to provide steady income for the recipients to spend as they see fit. So, as a commentary, if you identify as trans, you get $1,200 a month. It's unconditional. You spend it on whatever you want. All you have to do is click one of the 96 genders, get $1,200 just given to you. Because why wouldn't you? Because that's the end of this road. Once you've eliminated man, you've eliminated woman, children don't matter, the family doesn't matter, your relationship and marriage doesn't matter. Why wouldn't you give the people you deem the lowest on the totem pole money for free, just for being who they are? The mayor and the mayor's office went on to say, quote, "Our guaranteed income programs allow us to help our residents when they need it most as part of our city's economic recovery and our commitment to creating a more just city for all. We know that our trans communities experience much higher rates of poverty and discrimination, so this program will target support to lift individuals in the community up." End quote. I just, I know we talk a lot about misinformation and disinformation, but I just have to fact check that a tiny little bit. Found this slide from Statista, and we're gonna take a look at this real quick here. This is a slide from Statista.com, and if you're not reading or seeing, I'll just explain it to you. This is I think information from 2020, so a couple years old, but still. According to this slide, of the amount of homeless people in America, and maybe it's higher in San Francisco, it's fair, but according to this slide, in America, you know who the most amount of homeless people in America are? And it's not even close. White males. Oh, I know, those terrible, terrible white males. But they are the most homeless, and it's around 70% of the homeless in America. And the transgender number, which is on this chart, is 0.8%. It is not even close at all. And so in 2020, there were an estimated 280,612 white homeless males in the United States, the most out of any ethnicity, and men were 70% of those. So 280,000 white people, and 70% of those were men. So I'm not doing the math. You can do the math if you want. But 0.8% of homeless people in America were trans people. But sure, as the mayor and the mayor's office said, trans people experience higher rates of poverty. I guess that's just in your imagination, or maybe in San Francisco. I hate to be a fact checker here, but a couple 100,000 versus whatever 0.8% of that is, doesn't seem like the 0.8 is a majority. But hey, I'm not the best at math. And now these people in San Francisco who identify as trans get free money just for declaring one of the 96 genders that are on the application. This is the final utopia for the left. And I've talked about this before. We talked about it a lot in theory, critical race theory, critical social justice, that There is this ideal of a utopia that exists if you just clear out all of the debris that the civilization and the Bible puts in its way. You get to this utopia, and here it is. This is the utopia. You get free money for being the appropriate gender, and no one else does. You get rid of family, gender, marriage, children. None of that matters. Just your own perception of who you think you are and who you think you should be. I have to say, of course, all of this is kind of ridiculous, and it's not without consequence. And this is where God sees, God knows, you can't escape God. You are made in the image of God. You are created to be in a family. Again, Genesis 1. Both on this earth and in the family of God. What we do here on earth is to practice for God's kingdom. You might even say we're laying the groundwork for God's kingdom right now. Genesis 1 was not a fluke. It wasn't a suggestion. It is just the way. It's the way of the natural world. You see it in the natural world. You see it in actual biology. We're given this gift of life to find a spouse, get married, and have as many children as the Lord would provide. I know not everybody can have kids. Not everybody even wants to have kids. Not everybody wants to get married, and there is even in the Bible a gift of celibacy, but that is not the norm. The ideal is still marriage, family, children. And we need to prop up these institutions of society that encourages these kinds of things. For too long, we, conservatives, Christians, have stood back waiting for something to change in our society, magically or otherwise, for our values to be realized for the good thing that they are, instead of preaching, teaching, growing, encouraging, and creating culture. And really, what we need to do, my encouragement to you, hopefully, if you've made it this far, what you want to do is create culture. And we create culture by going from being single, getting married, having kids, and teaching those kids the way of Christ, and moving through this really difficult life. Thank you for listening today. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy. I appreciate just being part of this adventure that we're on called Church Public. So for Church Public, I'm Matt Odegaard. God bless. As always, keep the faith.